The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Harmon leaned forward, peering over her glasses at the woman in the sharp gray suit. "Mrs. Reynolds," she asked, "do you agree to divide the marital assets equally?" Sophia Reynolds smiled a calm, chilling smile that didn't belong in a divorce court. "Absolutely, Your Honor," she said clearly. "But first, I want everyone in this room to watch one video." At that moment, Daniel Reynolds, the man who had been her husband for 20 years, turned ghostly white. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went pale. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sophia, don't." But she didn't even look at him. With a single nod, the large screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. What happened next would destroy everything Daniel thought he had carefully hidden for nearly a decade. Nobody in that room yet understood what they were about to see, but 3 months earlier, none of this would have seemed possible at all. Sophia had spent 26 years in the United States Army. She'd earned the rank of colonel the hard way through deployments, sleepless nights, and decisions that could cost lives if made wrong. She had missed birthdays. She had missed Christmases. She had sat in a tent in a country whose name she couldn't say out loud to her own mother, watching a satellite photo of her daughter's 3rd birthday party, because she couldn't be there in person. Every sacrifice, she told herself, was for something bigger. For their future. For the family she and Daniel were building together brick by brick, deployment by deployment. Daniel had always said the same thing before every goodbye at the airport gate. "Go do your job, Soph. I'll take care of home." And she believed him, not because she was naive, but because belief was the only currency that made 20 years of distance bearable. For 2 decades, she wired her paycheck home. Her combat pay, her bonuses. Every allowance the Army gave her for hardship, for risk, for time stolen from her own life, she sent it back to the house on Maple Ridge Drive, to the man who promised to hold it all together while she held the line somewhere else. "He's taking care of us." She used to tell herself, lying awake in barracks that smelled like diesel and dust, picturing Daniel paying bills at the kitchen table, picturing their daughter's college fund growing quietly in some account she never had to think about. She trusted him the way she trusted her training without needing to check it twice. She should have checked. The day everything cracked open started like any other. Sophia came home 3 days earlier than scheduled from a training rotation at Fort Bragg, hoping to surprise Daniel with dinner and the good bottle of wine she'd been saving. Instead, she found him standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, waiting for her like he'd rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. "I've met someone," he said. No preamble, no softening. Just the words dropped on the tile floor between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Sophia felt her stomach fall through the floor, but her face, 26 years of discipline, had trained her face well, didn't move. "Who is she?" Sophia asked, though some part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. "Her name's Lily," Daniel said, almost proud of himself. "She's 26. Sophia did the math without meaning to. 26 years old. The same number as her years of service. She almost laughed at the cruelty of the coincidence, except nothing about this moment was funny. There was no apology in his voice. No trace of guilt in the way he stood there, chin up like a man announcing a business decision rather than the end of a marriage. And then he said the sentence that would replay in Sophia's mind for the rest of her life, sharp and clean as a blade. "The Army can keep you," he said. "I want a real woman." The kitchen went silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Sophia looked at him, really looked the way she used to study terrain before a mission, searching for what was hidden beneath the surface. She saw a stranger wearing her husband's face. "I understand," she said quietly. That was all. No tears, no pleading, no raised voice. She turned, picked up her bag from where she'd set it by the door only minutes before, and walked out into the cool evening air, leaving 20 years of marriage sitting on the kitchen tile behind her like something spilled and left to dry. She didn't cry in the car either. She drove with both hands steady on the wheel, the streetlight sliding across the windshield in long amber streaks, her mind already doing something her heart wasn't ready for yet, calculating. 20 years. Every deployment. Every dollar sent home. Every sacrifice she had made believing someone was guarding the home front while she guarded something larger. Something didn't add up, and Sophia Reynolds had spent her entire career learning to trust that feeling. 2 days later, she sat across from a divorce attorney in a downtown office that smelled of leather chairs and ambition. The attorney, a sharp woman named Rachel Kwan, slid a legal pad across the desk and asked what Sophia wanted out of the proceedings. Sophia didn't answer right away. She thought about the wire transfers, the joint accounts she'd never once questioned, the trust she had placed in a man because trust was supposed to be the foundation, not the weapon. "I don't want revenge," Sophia finally said, her voice level controlled the voice she used to give orders that mattered. "I want to know what my husband actually did for 20 years while I was gone." Rachel Kwan set down her pen, slowly sensing there was more beneath that sentence than a simple request. She had no idea yet how right she was. Rachel Kwan's office became Sophia's second home over the following weeks. Rachel brought in a forensic accountant named Marcus Whitfield, a quiet, precise man who spoke in numbers the way Sophia spoke in tactical assessments. Alongside him came a private investigator, a former detective named Jean Ferris, who had a way of looking at people like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever they were about to say. At first, Sophia assumed the investigation would confirm one thing, and one thing only: that Daniel had been unfaithful, that Lily wasn't the first, that the affair had been building for a while. That would have hurt, but it would have been a wound she understood. Infidelity was a betrayal she could file under human weakness. She had seen it before in other marriages torn apart by distance and temptation. But the deeper Marcus dug into the financial records, the clearer it became that infidelity was the smallest piece of what Daniel had built. "Colonel Reynolds," Marcus said one afternoon, sliding a folder across the conference table, his voice careful, almost apologetic, "your husband has a shell company registered in Delaware. It's been active for 6 years. Sophia opened the folder slowly. Bank statements, wire transfers, property deeds with names she didn't recognize threaded through legal language she had to read twice to understand. A townhouse in Charleston purchased under an LLC, a boat registered to a business entity that existed only on paper. Funds moved from their joint savings account into channels that eventually led nowhere Sophia could trace without help. He used the power of attorney you signed before your last deployment," Jean Ferris said, tapping a page near the bottom of the stack. "The one for emergencies, medical decisions, household matters." She paused. "He used it to open 2 new accounts and transfer assets 9 days after you left for Germany." Sophia sat very still, the way she used to sit during mission briefings when the intelligence coming in didn't match what she'd been told to expect. Her mind ran through the timeline automatically, the way training had taught her to process bad news without letting it show on her face. 9 days. She had been overseas 9 days, believing her husband was setting up a college fund, and instead he had been laying the groundwork for a second life that didn't include her. "This wasn't impulsive," Jean said quietly, watching Sophia's face for any crack. "This was a long-term plan, Colonel. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing, and they had years to do it." That night, Sophia sat alone in the small rental apartment she'd moved into near base housing, a laptop open on the kitchen table, a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She pulled up old emails, old bank statements, tax records going back a decade. She cross-referenced dates of her deployments against dates of major financial transactions, and a pattern began to surface, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, faint at first, then undeniable. Every time she left the country, money moved. Every time she was unreachable for weeks at a stretch, some new account appeared. Some property changed hands. Some signature, hers forged with unsettling precision, showed up on documents she had never seen. She thought of every deployment as an act of service to something larger than herself. Daniel had apparently viewed each one as an opportunity. There was a particular email that stopped her cold, a message from Daniel to an old college friend sent 4 years earlier discussing restructuring assets before things get complicated. At the time, Sophia had been in a briefing room halfway across the world, reviewing satellite imagery, entirely unaware that 4 years ago, her husband was already planning for a future that excluded her. She pressed her palms flat against the table, feeling the cool laminate beneath her fingers, grounding herself the way she'd learned to during moments of high stress overseas. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Breathe out for 4. It didn't erase the ache spreading through her chest, but it kept her hands steady enough to keep reading. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore. It was architectural. Daniel hadn't simply fallen out of love and stumbled into someone else's arms. He had constructed an entire secondary existence, brick by careful brick, using Sophia's absence as the mortar that held it together. Every medal she'd earned, every commendation, every night she'd spent unable to sleep because of what she'd witnessed in service to her country, all of it had unknowingly financed a life being built behind her back. She thought about calling her sister or her old friend from officer training just to hear a voice that didn't belong to a lawyer or an investigator. But something in her resisted the urge. This wasn't a moment for comfort yet. It was a moment for clarity, and clarity required a kind of solitude Sophia had grown used to over 26 years of service, the particular quiet of a person who has learned to carry heavy things alone. 2 weeks into the investigation, Jean Ferris called with something different in her voice, not the clipped professionalism Sophia had grown used to, but a note of genuine surprise. "Colonel Reynolds," she said, "we found something in the house, something on an old hard drive connected to your security system. I think you need to come see this in person." Sophia asked what it was. Jean hesitated, choosing her words with unusual care. "A video," she said finally. "One I don't think your husband ever knew existed." Sophia didn't respond right away. Outside her window, the base was quiet, the flag hanging still in the windless evening air. Something told her that whatever was on that hard drive was about to change everything, not just the case, but the entire shape of the reckoning still to come. Jean Ferris met Sophia at the house on Maple Ridge Drive on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind of overcast day that made the whole neighborhood look like a photograph left out in the rain too long. Sophia hadn't been back since the night she walked out with nothing but her bag and her dignity. Standing on the front porch now felt strange, like visiting a place that only resembled home in its bones. Years earlier, back when Sophia's first daughter was still in elementary school, and a string of break-ins had hit the neighborhood, Sophia had insisted on installing a full security system, cameras at every entrance, a system wired into a server in the basement that backed up automatically to an external drive. Daniel had complained about the cost at the time, calling it excessive. Sophia hadn't listened. 20 years in the Army had taught her that redundancy saved lives, even when it seemed unnecessary to everyone else. At some point over the last several years, Daniel had disabled most of the system, tired of what he called living in a surveillance state. He'd removed the visible cameras from the porch and the garage. What he hadn't known, what almost nobody knew, was that a secondary backup camera tucked inside a decorative shelf in the home office had remained wired into the old server the entire time. Forgotten, overlooked, quietly recording and archiving footage onto a hard drive that nobody had touched in years. Jean led Sophia down to the basement where Marcus Whitfield sat hunched over a laptop connected to an old dusty hard drive. The air down there smelled like cardboard and stale detergent remnants of a life Sophia no longer recognized as hers. "We found this while mapping the home network for financial records," Marcus said, not quite meeting Sophia's eyes. "I think you should sit down before we play it." Sophia didn't sit. She stood with her arms crossed, spine straight, the same posture she used walking into rooms where she already suspected the news would be bad. The video began. The angle was slightly elevated, looking down over the home office where Daniel had apparently held several private meetings over the past year. In the footage, Daniel sat behind the desk that used to be Sophia's father's, a desk she'd inherited and treasured. Across from him sat Lily, dressed sharply, scrolling through something on her phone. Beside her sat a man in a suit Sophia recognized from divorce paperwork, Daniel's attorney, and another woman with a laptop who Marcus identified as an accountant Daniel had hired independently of their joint finances. They spoke freely, unaware they were being recorded, the ease in their voices, the particular carelessness of people who believe no one is watching. "We need the offshore transfers finalized before the court date," The accountant said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "Once the divorce is filed, moving anything gets riskier." Daniel nodded, leaning back in his chair with the kind of loose confidence Sophia hadn't seen from him in years, not directed at her anyway. "She won't even notice," he said. "She never checks the accounts, too busy playing soldier to care about spreadsheets." Lily laughed, not unkindly, more like someone enjoying an inside joke. "The judge will probably feel sorry for her," she said. "Poor overworked colonel never home. That works in our favor, right?" "Exactly," Daniel said. "Nobody's going to blame the guy whose wife was gone 200 days a year." Sophia's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the screen with the same unblinking focus she used to bring to satellite footage of enemy movement. Then Daniel's attorney asked something that made the room in the video go momentarily quiet. "How long has this been in motion, Daniel, realistically?" Daniel smiled, the same easy, practiced smile Sophia remembered from their wedding day 20 years ago, back when she thought that smile meant something true. "Honestly," he said, "almost 8 years." The words landed in the basement like a physical blow. Sophia felt something in her chest crack quietly, not loudly the way ice cracks under weight it wasn't built to hold. 8 years. Their youngest daughter had just started middle school 8 years ago. Sophia had been overseas twice that year alone, missing a Thanksgiving and a 4th of July, believing every mile of distance was purchasing something worth having when she came home. Instead, it had been purchasing the opposite. The video continued a moment longer, talk of real estate, of an account in the Caymans, of paperwork, designed to make Sophia's military benefits look smaller than they were in the divorce filing, before finally cutting to black. The basement was silent except for the faint hum of the old server still running somewhere behind the shelving. Jean finally spoke. "Colonel, I think we have more than enough here to secure a very favorable settlement. Possibly criminal charges too, depending on what the accountant's involved in." Sophia nodded slowly, her mind already several steps ahead, calculating, assessing the way she'd been trained to do under fire. Rachel Kwan, who had remained quiet throughout the viewing, finally broke the silence herself. "Sophia," she said carefully, "with this video we win. Completely. We could end this next week." Sophia turned to look at her, and something in her expression made both Jean and Rachel pause. "Not yet," Sophia said quietly. Rachel frowned. "Why wait? This is everything we need." Sophia looked back at the frozen frame on the laptop screen. Daniel's easy smile caught mid-sentence, utterly unaware that the moment had been preserved forever. "Because I don't want a quiet settlement," Sophia said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I want the truth said out loud in front of everyone who's spent the last year believing his version of this story." Nobody in the room argued with her. Something about the stillness in her voice made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a decision already made, the kind Sophia had learned to make in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and this time she intended to see it through to the very end. The morning of the final hearing, Daniel Reynolds walked into the courthouse like a man who had already collected his winnings. He wore a new navy suit, the kind that fit a little too well for someone claiming financial hardship, and he greeted his attorney with a handshake and a smile that suggested he considered the whole ordeal little more than a formality left to complete. Lily sat 2 rows behind him in the gallery, her hair pulled back, her expression carefully arranged into something sympathetic and demure. Daniel's parents sat beside her along with his brother and sister-in-law, all of them dressed for what they clearly believed would be a difficult but ultimately just outcome. In their eyes, Sophia had never truly been present for this marriage. She had been a name on a deployment roster, a voice on a crackling phone line, a woman who chose a uniform over a wedding ring more often than any spouse should. Sophia entered separately dressed in a simple charcoal suit, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She caught Daniel's eye briefly across the room. He gave her a small, almost pitying nod, the kind you might offer someone you'd already defeated. The hearing began with routine procedural matters, but it didn't take long before Daniel's attorney began building the narrative they had clearly rehearsed for weeks. He described Sophia's career with a tone that made 26 years of honorable service sound like abandonment. Deployments were reframed as absences, Combat pay was reframed as compensation for choosing career over family. He painted Daniel as a devoted husband left behind again and again, forced to raise 2 daughters largely on his own while his wife pursued glory overseas. Mr. Reynolds sacrificed his own career opportunities, the attorney said, to maintain stability at home while Colonel Reynolds was quite understandably dedicated to her service. But a marriage requires presence, companionship, a partner who is there. Daniel took the stand next, and he performed the role with unsettling skill. His voice cracked at the right moments. He spoke about missing his daughter's graduation because Sophia had been in Kandahar. He spoke about spending anniversaries alone, about learning to parent without a partner physically present, about the particular loneliness of loving someone who kept choosing to leave. Sophia sat and listened to every word without flinching, though something cold moved through her chest, at the ease with which he twisted truth into weapon. Yes, she had been gone. Yes, there had been missed birthdays and lonely holidays. But loneliness had never been a license to steal, and sacrifice had never been an excuse for betrayal disguised as heartbreak. Several jurors in the gallery, family, friends, neighbors invited to observe, wiped at their eyes. An older woman near the back shook her head slowly, murmuring something sympathetic to the man beside her. Even Daniel's own attorney seemed to relax as the hearing progressed, sensing the room tilting further in their favor with every passing minute. Rachel Kwan remained composed beside Sophia, occasionally jotting brief notes, betraying nothing of what waited in the folder resting closed on the table in front of them. When it came time for closing statements, Judge Harmon addressed both parties with the practiced neutrality of someone who had heard 1,000 marriages unravel in this same room. "Before we proceed to asset division," she said, looking toward Sophia, "Mrs. Reynolds, do you agree to divide the marital assets equally?" The question hung in the air exactly as it had months earlier, though everything about the moment felt different now. Sophia rose slowly, smoothing the front of her jacket, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to lean in without realizing it was doing so. "Absolutely," Sophia said, her voice even and clear. "But first I'd like everyone in this room to watch something." A ripple of confusion moved through the gallery. Daniel's attorney glanced sideways at his client, expecting reassurance, expecting Daniel to wave it off as some desperate, meaningless gesture. Instead, Daniel's face drained of color in an instant. "No," he said louder than he intended, half rising from his seat before catching himself. "Your Honor, this wasn't disclosed as evidence, It was disclosed 3 days ago, Your Honor," Rachel said calmly, sliding a filed document across to the bailiff. "Properly and within the required timeline." Judge Harmon studied the paperwork for a long moment, then looked up first at Rachel, then at Daniel, whose composure had begun to crack in a way the courtroom had never seen from him before. Something had shifted in his posture, the easy confidence gone, replaced by the rigid stillness of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he might not actually control how this story ended. "Proceed," Judge Harmon said. Sophia nodded to Rachel, who connected a small laptop to the courtroom's display system. The screen flickered to life at the front of the room, still dark, still paused, waiting. Daniel's eyes moved to Lily in the gallery, and for just a moment something passed between them, not affection, but calculation. The silent recognition of 2 people realizing the ground beneath them had already begun to give way. "Don't," Daniel said again, quieter this time, almost to himself. But it was too late for that now. The room had already turned to watch, and Sophia, standing perfectly still at the front of the courtroom, reached for the small remote in her hand. The screen flickered once, then settled into a steady image the home office on Maple Ridge Drive captured from the small forgotten camera tucked into the decorative shelf. The picture quality wasn't perfect, slightly grainy, time-stamped in the corner with a date 11 months prior. But there was no mistaking the man behind the desk, no mistaking the woman seated across from him with her phone in hand. Sophia pressed play, and the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the overhead lights seemed suddenly loud. Daniel's recorded voice filled the room, easy and unbothered, discussing offshore transfers with the same casual tone he might use to discuss weekend plans. The accountant's voice followed, crisp and precise, outlining timelines for moving funds before the divorce filing became official. Then came the moment that made several people in the gallery visibly stiffen. Daniel leaning back in his chair, smiling, saying the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "She won't even notice. She's too busy playing soldier to care about spreadsheets." A woman near the back of the gallery gasped audibly. Daniel's mother pressed a hand to her mouth. Beside her, Daniel's brother stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as though trying to convince himself the voice on the screen belonged to someone else. The video rolled on unstoppable now, each sentence landing like another stone dropped into still water. Lily's laughter filled the courtroom speakers, light and careless, utterly unaware that the walls she trusted would one day speak against her. "The judge will probably feel sorry for her," her recorded voice said. "Poor, overworked Colonel never home. That works in our favor, right?" "Exactly," Daniel's voice answered. "Nobody's going to blame the guy whose wife was gone 200 days a year." Sophia stood near the evidence table, her hands folded in front of her, watching not the screen, but the room, watching the faces of people who, only 20 minutes earlier, had wiped tears at Daniel's testimony about loneliness and sacrifice. She watched those same faces now rearrange themselves into something closer to horror, closer to disbelief, as the truth dismantled the story they had just been told. The video reached its final and most damning stretch. Daniel's attorney on screen asked the question that had haunted Sophia every night since she first heard it in the basement. "How long has this been in motion, Daniel, realistically?" Daniel's recorded smile widened, easy and proud, a man congratulating himself in front of people he trusted. "Honestly, almost 8 years. The words hit the courtroom exactly as they had hit Sophia in that basement, not loudly but completely, the kind of silence that follows a truth too large to immediately absorb. Judge Harmon, who had remained perfectly still throughout the entire 3 minutes, finally leaned forward and reached for the remote herself, pausing the video on a freeze frame of Daniel's smiling face, caught mid-sentence, forever recorded in the act of celebrating his own deception. The judge removed her glasses slowly. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable weight. "Counsel," she said, looking toward Daniel's attorney, "would you like to explain this to the court?" Daniel's attorney opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at his client, searching for something, an explanation. A defense anything but Daniel simply sat frozen in his chair, staring at the now static screen, his face the color of old paper. "Your Honor," the attorney finally managed, "I was not made aware of the contents of this footage prior to today." "That's evident," Judge Harmon said dryly. In the gallery, Daniel's mother had begun to cry quietly into a tissue, though whether from shame or grief it was impossible to say. His brother stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom without a word, the heavy door swinging shut behind him with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Lily, seated near the back, had gone rigid, her carefully composed expression cracking at the edges, as heads throughout the gallery began turning toward her. Sophia remained standing at the front, calm, controlled, watching the collapse she had orchestrated, not with cruelty, but with the same precision she'd once used to plan operations where every variable had to be accounted for in advance. This wasn't vengeance born of rage. It was justice delivered with the discipline of someone who had spent 26 years learning that the truth properly presented needed no embellishment to devastate. Daniel finally turned to look at her, and for the first time since the day he told her the army could keep her, Sophia saw something unfamiliar in his eyes. Not arrogance, not the easy confidence of a man certain he held every advantage. Fear. "Sophia," he said quietly, his voice cracking in a way it hadn't during his earlier rehearsed testimony. "I can explain." "You already did," Sophia said, her voice steady, almost gentle. 3 minutes ago, very clearly. Judge Harmon called for a brief recess, her tone leaving no room for argument, and the courtroom erupted into hushed, frantic conversation the moment she left the bench. Attorneys huddled. Family members whispered urgently to one another. Lily rose and slipped quietly toward the exit, her earlier composure entirely abandoned, while Daniel remained seated, staring at his own hands as though he no longer recognized them. Rachel Kwan leaned toward Sophia, her voice low. "That went about as well as it possibly could have. Sophia nodded once, but she didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. What she felt was something quieter, the particular relief of watching a truth she'd carried alone for months finally become visible to everyone else in the room. She glanced toward the frozen image still glowing faintly on the courtroom screen, Daniel's smiling face suspended in the exact moment of his undoing, and allowed herself for the first time in a long while to breathe. The recess would last 20 minutes, but everyone in that courtroom already understood that nothing happening after it would resemble anything that had come before. The recess stretched into something longer than 20 minutes. By the time Judge Harmon returned to the bench, whispers had already spread beyond the courtroom walls, carried out through hallway phone calls and hurried texts sent from the gallery. What had begun as a routine divorce hearing had transformed into something far larger, and everyone present seemed to sense that the ground had shifted permanently beneath them. Judge Harmon wasted no time. "Given the contents of this footage," she said, "I'm ordering a full forensic audit of the marital assets effective immediately. All accounts associated with Mr. Reynolds, including any shell entities identified by the plaintiff's investigators, will be frozen pending review." Daniel's attorney attempted a brief objection, but the judge's expression made clear the matter wasn't open for debate. Within the hour, formal referrals had been made, one to the state's Financial Crimes Unit, another flagged for potential federal review given the offshore transfers Marcus Whitfield had traced through the shell company's records. What had started as a marriage ending in betrayal was rapidly becoming something closer to a criminal investigation. News of the hearing moved quickly through Daniel's social circle, the way scandal always does in communities built on appearances. Business partners who had trusted him with investments began making phone calls of their own, first to Daniel, then when he didn't answer, to their own attorneys. 2 contracts he'd been quietly negotiating fell through within the week. A country club membership he'd held for over a decade quietly declined to renew his dues. Lily left first. She didn't call, she simply stopped answering, and within days Daniel learned through a mutual acquaintance that she had moved out of the apartment they'd been sharing and back in with her parents 2 states away. Whatever she had imagined their future looking like, it apparently hadn't included the version of Daniel now under federal scrutiny. His own family proved little steadier. His brother, who had walked out of the courtroom without a word, didn't return his calls for weeks. His mother, still tearful over what she'd witnessed, told him gently but firmly that she needed time before she could look at him the same way again. The easy warmth of family gatherings, holidays, casual Sunday dinners, all of it dissolved into an uncomfortable silence that Daniel had never before experienced from people who had always unconditionally been on his side. Sophia, meanwhile, moved through the following weeks with the same measured discipline that had carried her through 2 decades of service. She met with Rachel Kwan to finalize settlement terms that now tilted overwhelmingly in her favor, not out of vindictiveness, but because the truth, once exposed, left little room for negotiation. She oversaw the transition of her daughter's college accounts back into protected trusts. She began slowly to reclaim pieces of a life that had been quietly dismantled behind her back for nearly a decade. But even amid the vindication, there were quiet moments that caught her off guard. Late one evening, sorting through old photographs while packing up the last of her things from a storage unit, she found a picture from their wedding day, Daniel young and unguarded, grinning at the camera with an expression she once believed was love. She sat with the photograph for a long moment, feeling not anger, but a kind of grief for the years she had genuinely believed in. The version of her marriage that had at least for a while felt real to her, even if it hadn't been real to him. Daniel called her twice that month. The first time she let it go to voicemail. His message was short, his voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him before. "Sophia, I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk? Please?" She didn't call back. The second time he called from a different number, and she happened to be near her phone when it rang. Something made her answer, though she couldn't afterward say exactly what. "Sophia," Daniel said, and she could hear immediately that he was crying, his composure entirely gone, stripped down to something rawer than she'd ever witnessed from him, even at their wedding, even at the births of their daughters. "I'm sorry, I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I don't even understand how it got this far. I don't understand who I became." Sophia stood by her kitchen window watching the evening light fade over a street she barely recognized as her own life anymore. Part of her wanted to feel triumphant, hearing him finally broken open the way she had been broken open the night he told her the army could keep her. But mostly she felt tired, the particular exhaustion that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time, and finally setting it down. "You already made your choice, Daniel," she said quietly. "A long time ago, 8 years ago according to you." He didn't answer right away. She could hear him breathing unevenly on the other end of the line, and for just a moment she almost felt something like pity for the man he had once been before. Whatever had changed him took hold. "I don't hate you," she added, surprising herself with how true the words felt as she said them. "But I don't have anything left to give you either. Not anger, not forgiveness. Just distance." She ended the call gently without cruelty and set the phone down on the counter. Outside her window, the sky had shifted into that particular shade of blue that comes just before nightfall, calm and clear and entirely indifferent to the wreckage of the day. Sophia stood there for a long while, feeling something inside her settle into place for the first time in months. Not happiness exactly, but the quiet, steady peace of a soldier finally standing on solid ground after a long and uncertain campaign. 6 months later, the auditorium at Fort Belvoir filled with the quiet, formal energy of a military retirement ceremony. Rows of folding chairs stretched beneath the high ceiling flags, positioned with careful precision along the stage, the air carrying that particular mixture of pride and solemnity unique to rooms where service is being honored rather than simply discussed. Sophia Reynolds stood near the wings in her dress uniform, ribbons and medals arranged across her chest, in careful rows that told the story of 26 years without needing a single word of explanation. Her hands were steady, though something in her chest fluttered in a way it hadn't before countless briefings, deployments, or even the courtroom months earlier. This felt different. This felt like closing a chapter she had never fully expected to reach the end of. When her name was called, she walked to the podium with the same measured steps she'd used crossing far more dangerous ground, and the applause that rose to meet her felt like something physical. A wave of sound from hundreds of people who understood exactly what her service had cost and exactly what it had built. Fellow officers stood. Enlisted soldiers she'd mentored over the years stood beside them, some with tears openly on their faces. Her 2 daughters sat in the front row, both grown now, watching their mother with an expression of pride so open it made Sophia's throat tighten before she'd even said a word. She spoke about service. About the particular kind of honor that doesn't announce itself, that simply shows up day after day in the smallest and largest of decisions. She spoke about family, not the family she had lost, but the one she had built within the army itself, the men and women who had stood beside her through deployments and losses, and the long, quiet stretches in between. She spoke about loyalty, and about the difference between people who claim to love you and people who prove it through years of consistent, unglamorous presence. She did not mention Daniel by name. She didn't need to. Somewhere in the back rows, seated alone near the exit doors, Daniel Reynolds sat quietly, having asked through an intermediary if he might attend. Sophia had agreed not out of sentiment, but because she no longer felt the need to keep him out of rooms that mattered to her. His presence didn't threaten the moment. He had simply become someone watching from a distance, no longer capable of touching the center of her life. After the ceremony, as the crowd began mingling near the reception tables, a young lieutenant approached Sophia hesitantly, clearly working up the courage to speak. She was maybe 25, sharp-eyed, her uniform still bearing the crisp newness of someone early in her career. "Ma'am," the lieutenant said, "I heard part of what happened. With your divorce, I mean. I hope that's all right to bring up." Sophia smiled gently. "It's all right." "How did you survive it?" the young woman asked. "Losing everything like that while still trying to serve?" Sophia considered the question for a moment, watching the late afternoon light slant through the tall windows behind the young lieutenant's shoulder. "I didn't lose everything," Sophia said finally. "I only lost the man who was pretending to love me, everything that actually mattered: my daughters, my career, the people who stood beside me through 26 years of this uniform, all of that stayed exactly where it was supposed to be. The lieutenant nodded slowly, something in her expression shifting as though she'd been given a piece of information she'd carry with her for a long time. Later, as the reception wound down and most of the crowd had drifted toward the parking lot, Sophia stepped outside alone for a moment, standing beneath the flag hanging still in the warm evening air. She thought about the night in the kitchen on Maple Ridge Drive. Daniel's voice sharp and certain. "The Army can keep you. I want a real woman." She almost laughed, watching the flag shift slightly in a breeze that had finally picked up. "He was right about one thing," she said quietly to no one in particular. "The Army did keep me. It taught me discipline, honor, integrity, and when the day came that I needed those things most, they turned out to be worth far more than everything he tried to steal." She stood there a while longer, feeling the last of the day's warmth against her face, before turning and walking toward her car, in her dress uniform, spine, straight steps, unhurried. She didn't look back toward the building, didn't glance toward the corner where Daniel had quietly slipped out sometime during the reception. For the first time in over 20 years, Sophia Reynolds walked forward into her life, belonging completely entirely to no one but herself, and it felt finally like freedom. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where it landed with you. Have you ever discovered a truth about someone you loved that changed everything you thought you knew? Leave a comment below, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe and stay close because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for spending this time with Sophia's story, and let's keep walking this journey together.